Erik, Chapter 13. I held Christine captive and silent in my arms until the door was fully closed out in the main dressing room. I counted slowly to 10 after it latched, hoping that would be long enough for Raoul to move away from the door. I felt like I could barely breathe as I inhaled the fragrance of her hair. I released my hold on her and set her gently away from me. I kept my hands on her shoulders a moment longer, making sure she was steady on her feet before I withdrew my support. I watched her as she backed away from me in fright, wrapping her arms around herself once more as she stared at my mask. The fear on her face disheartened me, but I had just physically abducted her after all. She looked around slowly, taking in the thick wall I had constructed and the spinet I kept in the passageway to accompany her with during her lessons. I picked up the lantern that sat on the spinet and opened its slide so that light flared out. I then moved the wall back into place, sealing us in darkness that was broken only by my lantern. "Come," I said. "Tonight we'll have our lesson in my home." I didn't know what else I might say to persuade her to come with me, so instead I simply picked up her hand and started leading her down the passageway. She followed behind me, but the way that she leaned away from me as I gently tugged her along told me that she was very conflicted about whether she should be coming with me or not. She looked behind her several times, as if she were either looking for someone to come rescue her or memorizing her escape route. We got down to the 5th cellar, and I turned to watch her as we approached the lake. I wanted to see the astonishment spread over her face as she beheld my lake. I was not disappointed. As an added benefit, the shock of finding a lake in the basement lessened her resistance to the point where I was able to get her settled securely into the prow of my little boat and push off from the shore with the boat's pole. She reached out a hand to touch the dark water, but pulled it back when I cautioned her. We approached my chambers across the lake, and I triggered the water gate to rise. We glided through the doorway, and she looked around at the main chamber that was dominated by my pipe organ and my piano. I tied the boat securely to the shore and helped her stand and step from the boat back onto solid ground. She stood looking around her while I lit some extra candles. My bedchamber and the dressing room, and the bedchamber I had built for her, were hidden behind doors that lined the side walls. I shed my cloak and hat, then took her hand and led her over to the piano. I indicated a space where she could stand to sing her lesson, and she automatically settled into it, squaring her shoulders and her stance to provide the best support for her sound. I sat at the piano and modeled the vocal warm-up I wanted her to sing. It had been over an hour since she had finished on the stage, and I thought her voice could do with some gentle warming up before we started working again. We finished the warm-ups and worked on one or two things that she thought she had done poorly during the performance. When that was done, I cast about for something else, something to prolong the pleasure I was feeling from watching her stand pouring out her silver song in my home. I picked up a sheet from the piano, something I had written down during a bout of insomnia a week or so before. She read it through flawlessly, then returned to the beginning and sang it in earnest. I played a few chords of accompaniment on the piano as she sang it for me. I had nothing to say after she finished, no little improvements I wanted her to make. She had sung it perfectly. She sighed as she let the paper in her hand drop to her side. She looked at me and gave me a wavering smile.
"It's beautiful,"
she said. "You inspired me to write it. I didn't know I had all this music in me until I heard your voice and it all came flooding out of my pen." I caught her hand, lifted it to my mouth, and kissed it. I didn't let it go afterward, but instead sat there smiling at her like a moonstruck idiot. She awkwardly pulled her hand out of my grasp, wrapped her arms around herself once more, and moved away from the piano, pretending interest in anything besides myself. I caught several surreptitious glances at my mask as she paced. Finally, she spoke up.
"Well, we've certainly had a good lesson, monsieur. Isn't it time we were heading back?"
I took a deep breath and stood. No, Christine, I need you here with me. I can't write down my music unless I hear it sung, and it can only be sung by you. You are the only woman I have ever heard who has the voice I need for my music. I was beginning to feel a little panicked. I was trying to explain to her why I needed her in my life so badly, and it was coming out all wrong. Her eyes widened a little bit, and she cast a quick glance at the lake, as if she were estimating her chances if she were to dive in and swim for the other shore. Quickly, I grabbed her hand again and pulled her closer to me. I thought that perhaps our shared language of song might get through to her where my words were failing so miserably. I started a love song duet that we had been working on. I sang my part quietly into her ear, and as she joined in with her part, I felt myself relax. The beauty of the music would do my communicating for me and tell her how good the music we would make together would be. She, too, began to relax. I pulled her closer still, turning her around so that I could wrap my arms around her waist from behind. She placed her hands over mine and held on tightly. I couldn't tell if she was trying to lift my hands away or not, but I was fast approaching the point where I did not care. She began to tear at my hands in earnest, wanting to be free of my clutches. I held tighter to her and darted my head into the place where her neck met her shoulder and planted a quick kiss. But then I realized I had again misstepped, as I sensed the panic rising up through her body. She tore herself out of my grasp and ran from me, choosing her direction at random. She ran to the bedroom I had built for her, opened the door, and charged inside. I caught up to her just in time to see her lift the wedding dress from the bed with shaking hands, staring at it in horror of what it represented, marriage to me. She tore her gaze from the dress and looked slowly around the room, taking in the double bed, the wardrobe, the dressing table stocked with duplicates of the items that littered her own dressing table in the theater above. Her gaze dropped back to the dress in her hands as she realized I had built all this in order to enable her to live here with me as my wife, with all the privileges and duties that marriage entailed. Her mouth dropped open and she looked back at me in the doorway.
What is all this?
I could tell from her eyes and the pleading tone of her voice that she was hoping I would tell her it was anything other than what it so obviously was. I walked slowly toward her. She dropped the dress on the ground and retreated quickly backward. I bent to pick up the dress and laid it neatly back across the foot of the bed. I walked closer to her then, with my hands held out cautiously as though I approached a wild animal. Christine, my Christine, I have come to realize that I love you. I want you. But don't worry, I want to marry you first. Damnation, I thought, this still isn't coming out right. I had spent so many hours consumed by fantasies of having her here that I had given no thought to what I might actually say to persuade her. I felt every inch the unsophisticated, isolated, bumbling idiot that my words made me sound like. It quickly ceased to matter what I said, though, as Christine chose that moment to faint. I sprang to catch her before she hit the floor and hoisted her awkwardly into my arms. I lifted her and walked to the bed with her. I felt something in my back twinge as I bent over, as carefully as I could, to lay her down on the pillow. I made sure she would be comfortable when she awoke, and stood over her gazing down for a long, agonized minute. My conscience told me I should leave and close the door quietly behind me. I bent down over her, gently smoothed her hair away from her ear, and whispered in it, Christy, I need you. My music isn't the same without you. I paused a long moment. Her brow creased briefly, telling me she'd heard my simple plea, then smoothed again as she relaxed into a deep sleep. I tugged a blanket up over her and tiptoed out of the room. I did not sleep at all that night. I soon abandoned the very idea of lying on my bed and paced the main chamber, walking back and forth as the hours of the night crept by. I walked back to Christine's bedchamber door more times than I could count, placing my hand on the doorknob, then walking away. Then I found my courage and entered the room. She still lay asleep on the bed, breathing deeply. I walked up to the bed and stood over her a dozen times, and each time I shook myself after a minute or so and walked back out of the room. I laid out the wedding dress atop her slumbering form, wanting to know what she looked like wearing it. Then I berated myself for daring to hope and lifted it off her, returning it to the foot of the bed. Finally, I eased myself onto the mattress beside her, trying not to shake the bed and wake her. I wanted to feel what it was like to lie next to her. In the end, I retreated from the room without waking her. I looked at the clock in the main chamber. It was just rounding 8 in the morning. I yawned deeply and then retired to my bed. I employed my usual trick of counting backward from 300 in Latin to take my mind off my horrible dilemma. I managed a few hours' sleep as the sun broke over the city streets 5 stories above my head. I awoke a few hours later and lay there for a moment remembering all that had happened. For some reason, I was suddenly remembering the 2 moments of absolute powerlessness I had had in my life. One with the manager of the traveling fair, and the other in the thrall of the Shah of Persia. I felt panic rising up my throat at the very memory of those 2 occasions. One had resulted in a violation of my trust. The other had resulted in the death of the woman I loved. Both events still haunted my nightmares regularly. I always knew when I awakened from dreaming of them because I would be covered in sweat and goosebumps that were so pronounced they were almost painful. In a moment of sudden clarity, I realized that the best thing I could do for Christine right now was to avoid putting her in a situation where she would feel that kind of powerlessness. I rose from my bed and straightened the clothing I'd been too exhausted to take off last night. Then I replaced my mask and hairpiece and set out across my main chamber for her bedroom, putting a kettle of water on the stove as I passed it. I knocked on her door but got no answer. I opened it tentatively and saw she had not answered because she had not yet awoken. I walked to the bed and gathered up the wedding dress. In my new state of clear-headedness, I knew that it would only agitate her to see it again. I hung it on a hanger and tucked it far into the back of the wardrobe, closing the doors firmly on it. Then I walked over to her and softly drew my finger down the line of her jaw. I marveled at how soft her delicate skin was. She felt my touch and sat bolt upright, eyes wide with panic as she realized she was not in her own bed. I backed away hastily as her hands flew over her body, checking to make sure she had not been harmed as she slept. She completed her check and relaxed somewhat, but tensed again as she realized I was still in the room. I think we got off on the wrong foot last night. Forgive me, but I've never properly introduced myself. My name is Erik. Erik Lemaitre. I'll have hot water for you to wash up with in just a moment. I paused, then added, You can probably tell this for yourself, but I did not touch you after you fainted, except for getting you to the bed. I thought you would want to know. I hoped she didn't think I was telling her this to gain some sort of praise, but I wanted her to know that she could trust her senses when they informed her that she hadn't been harmed. Her eyes never left my mask as I spoke. I left the room then, returning to her some minutes later with a tray bearing a basin of hot water and a small breakfast. I left her to it and went to sit down at my organ. A new musical phrase had popped into my head, and I used the organ to capture it and write it down on paper. I played what I had written and pondered what was wrong with the chords. There was something off about them. I listened again to the sounds in my ears, and then popped my eyes open to compare them with the music on the page. Ha! I thought. These chords should have an A sharp instead of an A. I was fully absorbed in the task of fixing each A, and there were a lot of them, when I suddenly felt my mask ripped from my face. I let out a scream of shock and anger as I felt its protective cover leave the ruin of my face. I clapped my hand to my face to cover the unsightly mess, and turned in a rage to see Christine standing behind me with my mask in her hand, staring open-mouthed at what she could see of my deformity. I lunged at her, intending to grab my mask back, but she eluded me, running back toward her bedchamber. I followed her, calling her names and yelling for her to bring back my mask. I was only half coherent as I ran toward her, and I must have been frightening to behold. I was every bit as angry as I had ever been at my foster sister back in the days when she had tormented me. But now that rage was sustained by a full-grown man, not a child. I am a little ashamed now to remember how quickly I abandoned my rational mind to its power. I burst into the bedchamber. She was standing beside the bed, examining the mask she held in her hand. I charged toward her and knocked her backward onto the bed. My momentum carried me over on top of her, and I landed atop her outstretched body in quite a compromising position. My earlier resolution to avoid making her feel powerless went up in smoke. Right then, I wanted her to feel my power and to know that she had none. The rage I felt was like a demon that possessed my very soul. I ripped the mask from her hand and tossed it on the bed beside us. I dropped my hand from my face and lifted myself halfway off her. Her eyes widened as they took in the full view of my deformity. The sight of her wide, fearful eyes did nothing to improve my mood. "Is this what you wanted to see, Christine? You know what they say about curiosity, don't you? It tends to have a negative effect on little pussycats like yourself. Damn you to hell, anyways! Where do you get the nerve? You and Pandora would be bosom friends, I wager. You have the same destructive tendencies." I grabbed her hands and captured both her wrists in one of my hands, stretching her arms above her head. Ugly sarcasm crept into my tone as I fit my other hand around her throat. It was all I could do to stop myself tightening my hand and cutting off her air supply. "Well, is it better or worse than you thought it would be? Go ahead, take a good look at it. You might as well, now that you've gone to the trouble of unmasking me." She seemed torn between staring at my face and desperately trying not to stare at my face. My anger left me suddenly, and I rolled away from her, releasing her hands. She sat up quickly and scurried as far away from me on the mattress as she could go. I sat slumped on the edge of the bed and dropped my head into my hands. Can you even befriend someone who looks this ugly? You certainly could never feel affection for someone who makes the gargoyles of Notre Dame look suave and debonair. And here I deluded myself that you might even learn to love me once you got over your fear of the way I look. I shook my head sadly, then sat, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. Tears blurred my vision for a moment, but I blinked them away. Christine looked at me for a long moment, then reached for the mask I had tossed aside. She held it in her hand while she stared at me, absently rubbing her throat with her other hand. Time seemed to freeze for a long moment as we sat there, neither of us sure what to do next. But suddenly she mastered her fear, extended her hand, and gave me back my mask. I stared at it, realizing that at the very least it could be construed as an olive branch of friendship. It did not signify that she could tolerate my face, but at least she had given me my dignity back. It was a start. I took the mask and turned my head away from her as I fit it back over my face. I checked to make sure my hair was in place, then rose from the bed, smoothing my jacket down over my front as I did so. She looked up at me, uncertain as to what I planned next. I reached down, grabbed her hand, and pulled her to her feet. I needed to get her back to the upstairs world and retreat into my normal solitude while I tried to figure out just what the blazes I should do next.